Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show, Science Facts and Fallacies, episode 231. I am your host, as always, Cameron English, joined again by Dr. Liza Dunn. Joined, as always, I should say, by Dr. Liza Dunn. We're both very excited to be here. The equipment is working correctly this week. It's a big it's a big accomplishment. We're hoping it's going to make a difference in the quality of the show moving forward. Liza, how are you? It's great to see you again.
I am well, thank you. How are you? Have you had a good week?
I have. It's very exciting being a dad. Keeps you on your toes, as you well know, as a mom, right? Kids, they run around, they eat stuff they shouldn't, they cry when they shouldn't. It's a good old time.
Yes, they very much keep you on your toes. Mine just got me to drive all the way to Southern Illinois for a tennis match. So, good times ahead for you, Cameron.
Okay. Oh, I can't wait. All right. Well, in the meantime, we've got 3 stories to talk about, as we always do. So let's jump right into these. First up, why do some global cancer agencies claim that using a cell phone, like drinking diet soda, poses a cancer risk? Next up, a new COVID vaccine is arriving this fall, but will anybody take it? And finally, meet the Beatles. Mealworms could be a food of the future. Yeah, all right. That's going to be a fun one too. But let's start with this first story, Liza. This is by a good friend of the show. His name's Dr. Jeffrey Cabot, cancer epidemiologist. And here he's talking about this well-worn idea that cell phones may cause cancer. And so he retraces the history of this a little bit. He says what really set off the controversy was in 2011, our friends at IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, they put out a monograph, and they said radio frequency energy, so the radiation that you're exposed to with cell phones, is a possible, in quotes, possible carcinogen. And that really set off the scandal. So you had the folks like RFK and a woman named Zen Honeycutt, who may not be as familiar to folks, but you had these kind of characters coming out of the woodwork and making these claims about cell phones and 5G causing cancer. So Cabot goes on, he says, there's really 2 ways to look at this question. The first is to look at the long-term data, right? Look at the best epidemiological data you have and see if there are any, he says, consistent, substantial changes in the number of cases of brain cancer. And there's different brain cancers. But he says, look at the trend. Does it go up? Does it go down? Is there any reason to think that a particular exposure, like radiation from phones, is to blame, right? So this is the best way you can do it, or probably the most robust way, I should say, you can do it. Now, the second approach, he says, minimizes the difficulty of identifying a solid trend in the statistics. And you start to look for like little correlations, right? So from 2000 to 2003, there was a blip in this particular kind of brain cancer. And then from this year to this year, there was another increase, and then there was a slight decrease. So basically, you look and you find trends that seem to fit the correlation that you're looking for. And this is a lot of times what you'll find. So when people like RFK Jr., excuse me, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., when these kind of people talk about the link to brain cancer from cell phones, this is what they do: is they will cite little bits of data, they'll cite individual studies, and here's the take home from Cabot. He says, after discussing all of this information that I've just summarized, he says all of this indicates that, contrary to the assertions of microwave activists eager to discern evidence of the impact of radio frequency energy on brain cancers, or some subset of brain cancers, there is no evidence, emphasis here, no evidence of a consistent upward trend in the rates of any of these entities over the last 10 years. So that should quell the concern, I would think, and at least until there's better evidence, Liza. But here we are still talking about this. So what do you think about this?
So yeah, I think that people have a hard time kind of wrapping their head around radiation. They hear radiation and they automatically think of Hiroshima or Nagasaki, and they get very fearful about nuclear incidents and things like that. What what most people don't realize is that radiation is just sort of a form of energy that is part of our everyday lives if you think about it. So and it doesn't cause entirely cause harm. There are kinds of radiation that can cause harm, and then there are kinds of radiation that don't cause harm. So when you think of the kind of radiation that can cause harm, that's ionizing radiation, right? And radio frequencies and things like that, which is a part of the electromagnetic spectrum, I guess, if you want to put it that way, um, are not going to cause harm in the levels that you're exposed to. So it's hard to explain the physics of this very clearly. But the way to think about it is that use light all the time, and you get background radiation in your everyday life that is not going to damage your DNA. Now, when you've got damage to your DNA because of ionizing radiation. So that can be like getting too many X-rays, or getting treated for cancer. As a matter of fact, people use ionizing radiation for brain tumors specifically. They use something called gamma knife, and that's ionizing radiation that is targeted to a cancer to kill it, to target its DNA and damage it enough so that the cancer dies. So it's funny. The claim is that a non-ionizing source of radiation will be able to penetrate your skull, which it can't do, and get into your brain tissue. And nervous tissue is actually relatively resistant to radiation, even ionizing radiation. But so they're saying that 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 through your cell phone, a non-ionizing source can penetrate your skull and expose those cells in your brain to DNA damage, and that DNA damage will eventually cause cancer. Um, that's just not the way cell phones or Wi-Fi or microwaves work. That's a much lower sort of level or frequency of wavelength of radiation. So it's not going to penetrate and get into your brain tissue. In fact, one of the kinds of ionizing radiation that's out there is called it's a particle called alpha particles, and we use them in smoke detectors and things like that. And alpha particles, you can block their penetration with a sheet of paper. So they can't penetrate, and they're at a much higher frequency than the radio frequency that you use. So people get because it is hard to explain how the physics of radiation works to most people. Most people think that they're all the same thing, and they're not. And you are not at risk of getting brain cancer from your cell phone, because it's not going to the radiation that it's emitting is not going to hit to be able to get penetrate that much tissue, if that makes sense. So that's the one thing. And then on the flip side is that mathematically there is no increase in gliomas or glioblastomas or things like that. And then on top of it, we use radiation directly in the brain to treat brain cancer. So I think that it's kind of important to understand that there are different kinds of radiation, and some of them cause harm and some of them don't. And a lot of them are used diagnostically and therapeutically. So that's the takeaway from that we did. Once again, IARC has, raised all sorts of fear around an association that was only true for 2 years in an epidemiology study without any um, evidence of causation. And we talked last week about the Bradford Hill criteria, and there's not a mechanistic, real way for your cell phone to get enough energy through your skull and into your brain to damage your DNA. And cancer is a disease of DNA, right? So if abnormal DNA, can replicate, make cells replicate quickly, and we can talk about that some other time. But so yes, it's an association once again, and it's not even, it doesn't even make the Prop 65 in California, because it's only a possible carcinogen, just like almost everything else in the IARC criteria. They've looked at over 1,000 different chemistries and things like that, and have only said that one is not a carcinogen, and that's caprolactam, the stretchy stuff in yoga pants. But everything else is a possible, probable, or definite carcinogen. So they go straight to the media with these associations, and it's unfortunate because a lot of people get very scared.
Yes, let me actually read the definition from IARC of a substance or an exposure that's possibly carcinogenic to humans. So this is Group 2B for people that want to look it up. But they say exposures in this category are based on limited or no evidence in humans, limited to insufficient evidence in animals. So, in other words, and this makes sense too, if you look up the studies analyzing the cancer risk of using cell phones or 5G or whatever, they all are based on blasting rodents with extremely high doses of radiation. So, in other words, if you're IARC, you can look at a study like that and say, okay, this has no real resemblance to what actual exposure from a cell phone is like. But nevertheless, if you give rodents enough radiation, they get cancer. And that's really what they're working from here. And I think that's important for people to understand.
Exactly.
Okay, one other thing I wanted to add before we move on, which is actually super entertaining to me. I don't know if it should be entertaining, but Cabot points out that in some of these studies, the cancers, the brain cancers, they're increased in a part of the brain, and maybe you alluded to this earlier. They increase it in a part of the brain that has the lowest exposure to this type of radiation. So, if your cell phone gave you brain cancer, there's a particular region of the brain where you would expect it to show up, and it actually shows up less frequently there. So, I
Yes,
mean,
yes. So
it. Yeah. Go ahead.
yeah, so I think it's very random where different brain tumors come from, and it's actually kind of interesting. A lot of people think that brain tumors come from the unregulated dividing of stem cells in the nervous tissue. So it's so. Uh, with cell phones, you've got the phone up next to your head in a region of your brain which is close to the temporal lobe. So temporal and parietal lobe. The parietal lobe's on the sort of back, more back and to the side, and the temporal lobe is down here. And so you would expect, especially if there was a true association, to see brain tumors happening there, right? If there was an association between cell phone use and right over your ear, right over your temporal parietal region, if that was a true association, you would expect to see all your tumors there, right? They do talk about a certain kind of brain tumor that's actually a benign brain tumor called an acoustic neuroma, which it goes in it kind of in that region. It's on a nerve though that's buried, um, and that. Once again, there's not an association there. You'd expect to see that kind of thing over and over and over again on the ear that you use the phone. Whereas they were talking about, the occurrence of these tumors in the frontal lobes. I don't know if they said anything about occipital lobes, but yeah, you're not seeing this. You should see the same place over and over again since your ear is in the same spot.
Yeah. Okay. So let's leave it there, Liza. Go read Jeffrey Cabot's story. It's a little in depth, and he points this out. He says, "Look, this is going to be a little annoying to read, but this is the conversation we have to have if we really want to figure out what's going on here." So read his story. If you're still curious, go read some of the resources he links to. There's lots of studies out there and so forth. So take a look at it. And in the meantime, let's talk a little bit about this new COVID booster that apparently is coming out in September. So here we're talking about a story from CNBC. It's called "The New COVID Vaccine is Arriving This Fall. Will Anyone Take It?" This is by a reporter named Anika Constantino. And she says here that Pfizer, Moderna, and Novavax are all slated to deliver a new booster that targets the latest subvariant of Omicron. So it's XBB.1.5, which just really rolls off the tongue. Um, And she says the issue is many Americans may not get this. And one of the things she points to is that the last booster, the last series of boosters that came out last September, it's about 17% of the U.S. population has received one of these from Pfizer or Moderna. So uptake is already low, and she talks to a handful of epidemiologists and infectious disease experts, and they point to a handful of things. They say there's pandemic fatigue. People are just sick of living in fear of COVID. They're tired of masking and mask mandates and vaccines and vaccine mandates and testing. They're just over it, which is something we've talked about on the show. Um, and then there's this belief that COVID is over in quotes. And we haven't talked as much about that, but that seems to be, people are going back to normal life and they're functioning as if COVID more or less isn't the threat that it seemed to be in 2020 and 2021. And it sort of declined as time went on, is what my experience here in California has been. And then she says there's a lot of confusion over individual risk that people face from a COVID infection. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, there's some questions and some uncertainty about how helpful the booster is going to be as well. So she says this is the starting point, and really the key to getting more people vaccinated, she says, based on the input she got from a handful of experts, is if you just tell people that this is part of a routine vaccine that you're going to get just like a flu vaccine, it sort of takes people out of this position of this is a pandemic and I'm trying to get vaccinated against this pandemic virus. It just becomes this is another endemic virus like the flu, and it's just part of normal healthcare. It remains to be seen if that's going to be the case. But what's your take on this, Liza?
Yeah, my take is I think that she is right that there is pandemic fatigue and things like that. Now, if you think about a normal flu year, not I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood. Double check me, but I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of only 58% of children get vaccinated against the flu every year. So it's a relatively low uptake for a yearly thing. People aren't that keen to get annual vaccines, and so especially if they perceive something to be not as virulent as things like smallpox, right? So unfortunately, that I think that a lot of people kind of think that maybe they've let their guard down, which I think is okay, because you got to come back to real life, right? And you've got to participate in activities of daily living and have your economy working and things like that. But COVID is still out there and circulating, and for most people it is like the cold, the common cold, because that's what coronaviruses tend to cause. But for at risk people it can be a significant problem. And so I think that having it become part of the routine vaccination schedule, I think that we as physicians are going to, I think that maybe is a good idea to try to explain what the benefits are. But I think also people are concerned that children in particular, generally speaking, don't get sick, so they want to know what's the benefit of it. And with the hype around the risks of it, they're much more reluctant, I think, to take it. So once again, it's a whole question of risk communication. I think it's fine to say, this is part of the routine vaccination schedule, and people who think that vaccinations are going to be beneficial for them I think for that audience that they will be more compliant. They'd be willing to take the vaccine. And I think that that's a good idea because COVID isn't always benign. Um, but the second thing is that we've got to figure out how to engage the general population that is a lot more hesitant to see whether or not this particular booster is going to benefit them. And there are some very very smart physicians out there that think that for people who are not at risk, or people who've had a previous infection and have had a vaccination, are going to be pretty well protected. And so until we do a better job of communicating around the benefits and safety of this vaccine, I think we're going to have a great deal of hesitancy.
One of the physicians that, and you may have this gentleman in mind, who's been um, skeptic is the wrong word, I think, but he has been very open about his doubts about the efficacy of booster shots, and that's Dr. Paul Offit. from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And if you're familiar with him, you know he's a very, very high profile advocate of vaccines. He's written, I want to say, 12 books at this point about various aspects of the vaccine safety debate. Um, and he's very critical of RFK. But nevertheless, during the pandemic, um, he has said multiple times that, boosters may not be necessary for everyone. And he says, when the first vaccines came out, they came out against the wild type strain, the Wuhan strain, whatever you want to call it. He said they worked really, really well, and they were developed quickly. It was really amazing, frankly. He says, but as recently as August 4th, and I just watched an interview with him in preparation for this. He says um, a booster buys you a few months of protection from mild illness. I don't see that as a viable public health strategy. So meaning that that's for people who are healthy. Now, for as you said, right, for a higher
Yeah.
risk population, the booster probably helps. But he said, for the COVID shots, since the very beginning of ever since we've had them, the benefit is it keeps you from getting really, really sick and ending up in a
That's right.
hospital and in the morgue. Right, that's the key. That's what they're most useful for. Nevertheless, the booster doesn't seem to be a part of that. At least that's what he said on August 4th. So maybe that'll change. The information comes and goes. I'll put the link to that interview because I
And I
think
think
it's
it
helpful. Um,
depends.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think it depends on the variant, right? So when you've got a rapidly mutating virus and as immune escape, so people get worried that a new variant could cause actually more harm, right? Could get worse, and so I think that that's why people are so eager to talk about in the public health world are so eager to talk about these boosters as covering that kind of stuff. But I think the duration of immunity is questionable with the boosters. I think that there is good evidence that people have robust immunity if they've had a prior infection and vaccines. I think that people are generally not dying in as dramatic fashion as they were early on in the pandemic and with the Delta variant. But so people are a bit cautious. But I tend to agree with Paul that we're not going to get a lot of bang for our buck from a public health standpoint, telling everybody over and over and over that they should get boosted over and over and over for mild variants.
Yeah, you sort of sense this tension in the story if you go and read this, everybody. Because one of the things she says in here, and at least I struggled to comprehend why this is helpful advice. So she says people who recently had COVID may also want to wait longer to get a new shot so they can maximize the protection they get from vaccination. So I'm sitting here and I'm like, and by the way, I got the COVID vaccines. I'm very much, I don't know why I have to do this, but let me just qualify for anybody out there. My son got all his shots. Vaccines are awesome. Okay, now with that out of the way,
Mine too.
right. So you're talking to people who have already gotten the virus, and you're like, now you need to wait to get the vaccine against the virus that you already have, so you can get the most immunity. And I'm like, I could see why somebody who's hesitant would read this and go, what are you talking about? I already got it. Why are you trying to push this on me and tell me that I need to get this, and this virus is still really deadly when I just survived it? So I'm not saying that there's no reason to get a booster, but it seems that again, the communication aspect of this is not being handled as well as it should be.
That's exactly right, and I think that that's what explains the low uptake of these boosters. And once again, I think that these are wonderful vaccines. I think that they have they really do keep people out of the hospital and things like that. But I think that the issue is that one, we haven't communicated it very well, and two, I think that people do have those questions in their minds, and reasonable people, not anti-vaccine people. These aren't Del Bigtree or RFK Jr. running around. These are people who are like, I got the virus. My immune system should have worked against the virus. I survived the virus. Why do I need a booster? So I think that that's the underlying problem.
Yeah. Well, one other thing Paul Offit said, and I have to confess, I don't understand all the immunology here, but he said T cell immunity after you get a COVID vaccine is really, really strong. And that is what protects you against severe infection. So the antibodies may wane relatively quickly,
That's
but
right.
okay. So talk about that if you would, because I think that's helpful.
Yeah. So you've got your basically, let's maybe start at the very beginning, and I hope this doesn't draw it out too long. But if you think about, we just talked about DNA in the last segment, but what DNA is really a cookbook. If you think about it as a cookbook, and it resides in the nucleus of the cell, and your genes are recipes for proteins, which are the building blocks for your body. They do make up all the machinery of the cells and things like that. And so when you need to make a protein, your very own personal mRNA goes into the nucleus of the cell and acts kind of like a chef. It transcribes or writes down the recipe or your for a protein, which is coded by the gene, the recipe for the proteins in the gene. It then goes out of the nucleus into the cytoplasm of the cell, which you can think of as like a kitchen, and it goes and it takes that recipe to, let's say, it's like an oven that's like, it's called a ribosome. And what that does is it has a bunch of sous chefs bring amino acids, which are the building blocks of your protein or the ingredients for your proteins, and put them together and bake it in the ribosome. And then as it exits the ribosome, it gets decorated and packaged kind of like a cookie, and then gets transported to its place where it functions. So that's how that works. Now, when you think about these mRNA vaccines, what they do is they skip the nuclear part, right? They don't have to go right down the recipe. They are the recipe for the proteins, right? And so what happens with the mRNA vaccine for COVID is that it is the recipe for the spike protein, and you can have one recipe, and then you can change it if the protein mutates, or if the virus mutates and makes a slightly different protein. You can change it quickly. That's what's so beautiful about these particular vaccines. And so when you get a little shot of this mRNA in your muscle, what it does is it goes into the cell and uses that cellular machinery to make the spike protein. And so it's like an antigen, right? So, and the body then introduces that antigen to the immune system. And so the immune system, the innate immune system, with the very first frontline army people, when they see this abnormal protein, they'll be like, "Whoa, I'm gonna grab you. I'm gonna use chop you up in my cell, and I'm gonna put parts of you on to the cell surface to introduce you more to the immune system." So that's the natural way things work when a virus or a bacteria gets into the body. And so that when it introduces the T cells to these antigens, it starts a whole cascade of events. One is you turn on B cells, which make antibodies, and then the other is you is turn on memory cells, so memory T cells, and natural killer cells, which is another kind of T cell, to be your sort of storage bank for when you see this protein again. So the next time a COVID virus comes floating around and it's covered with a whole bunch of spike protein, your T cells go, "I remember that," and your B cells start producing all sorts of antibodies that go jump on that spike protein and wave to the soldiers in your immune system, saying, "Here, I'm here. This is bad guy." Before the virus can ever even get into the cell, the immune system has a memory function that turns back on and goes and makes more antibodies and makes more immune cells to attack and kill that virus before it ever gets intracellular. And that's the important way that the immune system works. And the mRNA vaccines and vaccines in general do that. They stimulate, they boost the immune system. They stimulate the immune systems before you can get a florid infection that can kill you. So I'm hoping that answers your question.
That's great. And that's exactly why. it's useful to have a doctor on the podcast to explain all this. I think to go back to the original point, though, the point is that you're still protected even if you're not getting every single booster dose. And I think sometimes that gets
That's right.
overlooked in the media coverage, is that you have to get this latest booster or this new subvariant is going to knock you out. That's not necessarily true, and those are some of the nuances that are getting lost in this rush to say, everyone needs to get it. It's a bit frustrating, I think,
It is a bit
for
frustrating,
that
yeah.
to
And then
appear
the
in the
other thing is
headlines
that,
over and over
people
again.
are like, how can I still yeah. So the other thing that happens is that people say that then how can I, if I got a vaccine, how can I test positive again? I'm not supposed to have this, I'm not supposed to get this again, right? If I get the vaccine, that was the sort of common thing. You can test positive. The coronavirus could be in the mucous membranes of your nose, right? But it's not able to get it, you've got with your immune response, you're fighting it before it actually gets into your lungs and things like that. So you can still test positive, and you may have a little tiny cold, but you're not going to get a florid infection. There's just a lot of immunology is hard, and it's hard to explain, kind of like ionizing radiation. And so, when people have questions, I think that these questions are valid questions. So, your immune system has been primed to react, so you don't go to the hospital or don't die. And so, I think that that's important for people who are at risk may have a much higher benefit from. These things. People with immunosuppression may get a better reaction if they stimulate their immune system. But people who are generally healthy and kids, there's a lot of people who feel like they've already been vaccinated, they've already been infected, and they probably have pretty robust immunity. And immunizing against a cold in those people may not be as persuasive as with others.
Very helpful. Really, really useful stuff. It's important to consider everything, all the information you have access to. And again, Paul Offit's a great resource. So are you, so it's good to have all this information at hand. So take that as you will,
Paul
everyone.
Offit's Paul Offit's in a movie it's called "Shot in the Arm" that I would encourage everybody to watch about the how the that Scott Hamilton Kennedy made. He's the director. He's the same director of Food Evolution, and he's talking about how the anti-vaccine movement got started. So I think that that's a very worthwhile film to try to go see. That goes into this in more detail.
Yes, and after you do that, read his book. Well, he's written a bunch, as I said, but the one that I found really helpful is called Deadly Choices. I think it's from 2011 or so, and he details the history of the anti-vaccine movement in Europe and in the U.S. And he talks about the impact that it's had, and he explains the science along the way. It's super helpful. I need to reread it actually because I forgot a lot of it, but if you want just sort of like a ground level understanding of vaccination and immunology, it's really good, and for me, I've never had issues with vaccines, but it explained things in a way where I was like, okay, I get this now. And if someone was concerned, he takes on the objections in a way that's not confrontational, and he says,
Yep,
here's how it works, and so that's enormously helpful. So he's just a great resource all around.
he really is.
Okay, so last story of the day. This one is, I don't know. It's going to be fun. Okay, so we're talking here about a story by Ricky Lewis. She's a geneticist, very helpful writer. I've learned a lot from her over the last few years. But the story is called Meet the Beatles. Mealworms could be a food of the future. So, as we've talked about on the show, there is this growing push to get people to eat insects as a source of protein because supposedly animal agriculture is destroying the planet and there's too many people and climate change, and therefore you have to eat bugs for breakfast. And I really enjoyed the story because she sort of acknowledges how disquieting this idea is for people in the West. And she gives this interesting anecdote about how she was babysitting one time, and they had the people she was babysitting for, they had a lot of animals that ate insects, and the insects, I forget exactly what happened, but
A monkey
that's
grabbed a can of mealworms. And all of a sudden there are mealworms everywhere.
Yes, that's right. So in other words, she sort of sets up the case for why people want you to eat bugs, I should say. But then I think she recognizes the inherent ick factor that a lot of people have in this. Nevertheless, she goes on and she says, um, she says climate change, she says population growth, these are problems. And then she points to the European Union that in 2020, regulators over there said, uh, this is a viable source of protein and it's safe for people to consume. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And there's a couple of quotes from the story I just found really amusing. So she says, mealworms are nutritious. They can be popped into the mouth whole like cheese doodles or ground into powder to add to a smoothie or soup. The worms are rich in protein, a great nitrogen source, although we can't digest the nitrogen in the crunchy chitin coats. I believe that's like their
Chitin, yeah.
chitin.
Ah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And she says the fats are healthy too. Um, and then one final thing she says, she says, farming mealworms is more environmentally friendly than raising cows, sheep, and pigs. And this is important for something we'll talk about later. But despite being promising for sustainable food security, mass production of mealworms remains relatively primitive and challenging. And that's interestingly enough from a news release from a company called Y Insect, which is one of the companies on this front line of getting you to eat bugs. So there's a lot going on here. There's a lot more we have to learn. But jump in here, Liza. What do you think of this?
So first of all, I am very reluctant to eat any kind of bugs whatsoever. And secondly, when people are all worried about GMOs and things like that, one of the things that comes up in regulatory agencies is that you have to test for allergy to make sure that GMOs aren't going to go the protein that you use in your plant that's genetically modified is not going to cause allergy, and there's strict rules about making sure that there's not going to be an allergic reaction, and actual testing of these crops to make sure that people who are allergic will not have anaphylaxis or things like that. And the other thing that you want to make sure is that you don't have infectious agents in there, and so the GMOs are incredibly tested. Now, we do know that that mealworms and several other insects have cross reactivity with shellfish allergies. So people who are allergic to shellfish, and I've taken care of people who've had full blown anaphylaxis and almost died from shellfish, right? Those people would be at risk of having anaphylaxis as well if they're eating these mealworms. So that's something that I think if GMOs are going to be held to that kind of level, I think that this should be as well. Second thing is that there was a study done relatively recently where they were looking at farmed insects, and they found a significant proportion of them were infected with human pathogens, E. coli infections. So, I mean, one of the bugs that they're having people want to eat is, the common housefly. Oh, well, you get Shigella if you get 12 10 organisms can transmit full-blown Shigella from person to person, and that's a dysentery where people have bloody diarrhea, and they can die from it. They can get very, very, very sick. E. coli 0157. How do you control for that? And that kills kids. So I think that you can't, unlike a steak where you can, have much more control over the gastrointestinal tract of cattle contaminating a steak. And there are ways of doing that. When you're eating these insects, you're not taking out their GI tracts, and you're not taking out, you're not, getting bacteria off of them, or I don't know of the standard method that they do. So I think that we need to figure out, if before we recommend this being on everybody's menus, ways of preventing allergy and regulating for allergy, and ways of preventing true insect-borne illness, right? Of pathogenic organisms. So I don't think this is ready for game time or prime time right now. I'm not sure I'd be all that interested. And the other thing that people don't talk about when they talk about livestock farming and things like that is it's not just milk and meat and eggs that comes from that. There's a whole huge amount of products that wool from sheep, for sweaters, and a whole variety of things that wool is used for. Every part of the animal is used in some capacity or another, right? glue, gelatin, agar gels and things like that. You're going to use all of these parts of these animals. So it's not just that everybody's having a steak and that's not environmentally friendly. The animal ag plays into so many other different products that people don't usually think about. So there's a guy by the name of Eric Sunnard, I think is his name, who did a TED talk once, and he said, without farmers, you'd be uh, uh, hungry, naked, and sober. So, so, so I think that people forget that, and then in terms of environmentally, animals are part of the whole life cycle. You can't necessarily grow plants everywhere, right? Or that plants that feed people everywhere. And so you take plants that people can't consume, like grass, and you turn them into a really high protein and high quality protein, and that really helps people live longer and do better. And then they, are part of the nature cycle. You've got to fertilize those plants with manure, right? If you, especially if you're going to go all organic, all of these things are intertwined. And I think taking animals out of the equation with the notion that it's bad for the environment really is sort of forgetting a whole lot of different aspects of how important animal ag is. And I'm not gonna be chewing on any insects anytime soon. And then in terms of animal welfare, the animals that live on their own in the wild, that they don't necessarily die these beautiful, wonderful deaths, right? That it's animal ag that the farmers taking care of their livestock really care for the welfare of their livestock, but if they were out being feral pigs or feral cattle, they die pretty horrific deaths. Mother Nature's not nice.
Indeed, indeed. All very good points. Let me add a couple of things here. I want to go specifically after the reasons why we're supposed to eat bugs. Uh, this is utter nonsense. And amusingly enough, I'm using studies from the Lancet to demonstrate this, because the Lancet, the Eat Lancet Commission, they've been part of this. They have been very much on the front lines of, let's embrace Marxist medicine because Karl Marx can teach us a lot about healthcare, because the Soviet Union was
That's
awesome,
exactly
right? Right. You want a root
that's
canal
exactly
without
that's
a anesthetic?
without
Yeah.
any Novocaine. Yeah, yeah, that's exactly what they do.
Okay, let me get in here. So this is a 2021 study from the Lancet, and they do these periodically, but it's a 20-year study looking at mortality caused by weather, and very, very interesting here. So they point out that most excess deaths were linked to cold temperatures. So roughly about just under 9% of death globally, excess mortality, is weather related. Now, hot temperatures are involved in some way in less than 1% of deaths globally. And this is a direct quote from the Lancet, everybody. The study indicates that global warming might slightly reduce the net temperature related deaths. Okay. So, what I take from this then is that we are getting better. And again, this is this is the case for technology we've been making on the show and Genetic Literacy Project and the Breakthrough Institute. Lots of places, lots of people in economics too have been saying, as technology improves, as we get wealthier as a world, we get better at protecting ourselves from weather-related events, and really anything, but like really cold weather or really hot weather, we get better at mitigating that. Here's one other thing. This is a study from 2018. This is by a researcher named Roger Pilkey Jr., very well known in the climate space. So in this 2018 paper, he says, since 1990, both overall and weather climate losses in economic terms have decreased as a proportion of global GDP. So fewer people are getting sick and dying because of the weather, and we're losing less stuff because of the weather. Okay, so and again, this is the Lancet. This is as mainstream as peer-reviewed climate science gets. I don't know what else to tell you on that.
Yep.
And one other thing, and then jump in here. I'm sure you have a lot to say. Um, Ricky Lewis says this in the story, and no fault of her. I mean, there's a lot of people who have said, the population's booming. We got to figure this out. The population's booming. That doesn't seem to be the case anymore. And this is another study. This is 2020, also published in The Lancet, and the BBC reported on it. And I believe, no, I thought I was going to say they're from your alma mater. I don't think that's true though. But in any case, quoting the BBC here, the researchers expect the number of people on the planet to peak at 9.7 billion around 2064. Before falling to 8.8 billion by the end of the century. And then they quote the researcher, his name's Christopher Murray. He says, most of the world is transitioning into natural population decline. I think it's incredibly hard to think this through and recognize how big a thing this is. It's extraordinary. We will have to reorganize societies. And the article goes on to talk about, we're going to have immigration to the West, but then the problem is that in African countries and, right now, parts of the world that are poor, they're going to get wealthier too, and they're going to have fewer kids, right? So I don't want to go off on a rabbit trail. The point is, the weather is not killing people, and there are fewer people. So the problem is not going to be there's too many people, we have to eat bugs. The problem is we're not going to have enough people to breed the bugs and sell them to everyone else.
Okay. Or farm in general. That's exactly
right. Right. Go ahead. I'm sure you have lots to say.
Which is why you want to have the technology. So one of the innovation that we have. First of all, we've been since the 1800s going on and saying that that the population is going to outstrip the food supply. The carrying capacity of the world is going to come to an end, and somehow we've managed over and over and over again to meet the demand. And I mean, the last time around was the Green Revolution with Norman Borlaug, and he fed 1 billion people. But then we've got innovations since then that have the potential to feed uh, really 10 billion people if we do the right things, if we make the right decisions. And going back to the kind of farming that we did in the past is not going to meet that need. And so I think that we need to be open to the scientific advances that people in agriculture scientists in agriculture have made to try to feed as many people as possible. Now, what it's interesting is that when people are fed and people have a little left over that they can sell, you wind up having a kind of a virtuous cycle. So more kids go to school, you can learn about biology and science and art, architecture, whatever you want to learn. But it helps civilization blossom. And as civilization blossoms and gets more educated, they come up with more innovations to deal with different problems. So going back in time doesn't necessarily, and romanticizing subsistence farming is not going to fix that problem. And what you need when you are subsistence farmers is you need more and more and more kids to help you try to survive, because everybody needs to farm to make grow their food. Whereas we've got 2% of our population farming, and in the West and in China and in Japan, very well fed nations, you're seeing population decline. In France, as a matter of fact, people are paid to have extra children. So I think that the natural sort of state of affairs is that as a population is fed, their reproductive rate goes down, and it's because they don't need as many children to survive. So I think that's where it is. And so once again, hopefully the science will prevail. And I think that this Dr. Murray that you were just talking about is pretty spot on. And I think that we've got evidence to suggest that that's the case with what's going on in the West, the demographics in the West.
Yeah, I don't think it's deniable at this point. And you're seeing one of the ways I think this is you're seeing journals like The Lancet publish that, but then you're seeing people in different fields of expertise who are starting to say, like economists that work on issues like Social Security and entitlements, they're going, okay, we owe this much money to old people. We have these many people paying taxes. The math doesn't add up. There's a problem here, right? So I think what that illustrates is that these doomsday scenarios are wrong. There's an eight-letter
Yep.
word. There's an eight-letter word works great as fertilizer. It's just not. It's just not true. I don't know what to tell you. Here's another example. I just came across this on Twitter. This is from the New York Times in 1952. They say Country faces an overpopulation by 1975, with farms unable to feed all, experts say. Okay, 1952, right? There was no global collapse or collapse in the U.S. in 1975. It's 2023. There are
And
there are.
we're all chubby, right? So, I mean, there's something wrong there because we're not all like outstripping the food supply.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I mean, I don't want to say, again, as someone who's struggled with my weight over the years, like obesity is a serious problem, but I think it goes to show it's not a lack of access to calories in
It's
many
not a
parts.
lack of.
Yeah. One other thing before we move on and land the plane for the week. Ricky Lewis talks about the animal rights movement, who are very, very displeased with this whole bug farming operation that's in the works, and they talk about how you are barbecuing and boiling and shredding millions or trillions upon trillions of these poor little bugs, and animals have rights. And I want to try to find a quote from it. It's just super funny because it's like I think the animal rights people will finally be useful at some point, in that they might scream and bark so much about this that they might actually delay. So here's the quote. There's a pair of ethicists. There are peer-reviewed studies on this. This is really fascinating. So they say, don't farm bugs. Insect farming bakes, boils, and shreds animals by the trillion. It's immoral, risky, and won't resolve the climate crisis.
Well, I also think it's kind of very interesting that journals like The Lancet and the New York Times are talking about insect Armageddon at the same time that they're
Right.
saying that we should be feeding people insects. So, if we don't have enough farmers to grow enough mealworms, right, and things like that, and we're all going to start eating, 10 billion people are going to start eating bugs for protein. Hmm. That makes me very nervous about the fate of insects.
Yeah. Well, see, we'll ban all the pesticides, and we won't grow any crops, and we'll just eat bugs. It'll be a grand old time.
It'll be a grand old time. That's right.
Oh, it's so funny. As we wrap up here, it is interesting nonetheless, though, that if you read the science press and you even the mainstream New York Times and so forth, like, you're really encouraged to partition your thinking, and that's a great example. It's like, pesticides are killing all the insects, and our whole food chain is going to collapse. Also, we need to eat lots of insects because the food chain is about to collapse. It's like this absurdity. It's the same thing with the opioid issue. It's like, pharma companies are evil and they're corrupt, and they will kill you and your children if it makes them a little bit of money. Also, take this vaccine by the same pharma companies. It's really, really good, and it's going to keep you alive. It's like there's just all of these competing
It's
ideological sympathies, and it's just silly. It's like we have to step back and
and
look at.
it's devoid of truth, right? You've got if you stick with the science and get away from the ideology, you are going to be much closer to the truth. And I think that that's a really important thing to take away.
Absolutely. Incidentally, GLP's tagline is "Science, not ideology." So, whole nother discussion, but I think it's an important point, right? Just follow the data as best you can, recognize that you have biases, and try to put them aside. Your life will be better that way, I think. Okay.
Agreed, 100%.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's going to do it for us this week. We'll be back next week for episode 232. In the meantime, follow us on Twitter at Dr. Liza MD, at CamJ English, at Genetic Literacy for Genetic Literacy Project. They put this all on. They publish the stories. They give us the platform. It's really awesome. Thank you all for listening. By the way, next week we've got to talk a little bit about the lab leak. We did get some feedback, and we just didn't get to it on the show. But we had a reader reach out about that, so we'll talk about that a little bit next week. And with that, we'll see you next time.
Bye.